Hi, my name is Marissa Lamagna, and in 2008, I started Bay Area Green Tours. During the last 12 years, I've had the privilege of learning from so many change makers, thought leaders, and what I like to call solutionaries all around the Bay Area. As a result of the pandemic, we had to stop doing tours. In some ways, it's a silver lining because now we're able to connect to some of the people that we've learned from and share them outside of our backyard with people from all over the world. Bay Area Green Tours is a small grassroots organization. After the pandemic, people came to help us pivot and reinvent ourselves. I'd like to begin to compensate them as we continue to look for new ways to sustain our work. We appreciate it if you could make a donation, share our programming, and come back for the next time for Solutionaries Speak. In 2019, I did a permaculture training with Vital Cycles with Lydia Nielsen and Anne Frywald. I learned so much from her. She is our moderator for Solutionaries Speak. I'll turn it over to Anne now. And thank you for joining. Please share this video and stay tuned for our new programming.
Wonderful. Welcome everyone to our very first Solutionaries Speak talk of 2021. Thank you, Marissa, for the beautiful intro. And we'd also like to thank our sponsor today, Beneficial State Bank, for the programming that we're doing. And I would also like to thank Della Duncan for being our very first solutionary in 2021. It's so wonderful to have you here, Della.
Happy to be here.
Wonderful. So we have, I'm just going to introduce, I have Lydia Nielsen, who you saw in the intro video. My business partner and partner is on doing some tech support. There she is today. She's going to be letting people in to the into the call as needed and helping monitor the chat. If you have questions, definitely save them. We have time for questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And actually, Della and I have a very special friendship, and she was actually also part of our 2020 Vital Cycles cohort following Marissa, and we've known each other for a while, and I am always inspired by her take on economics and regenerative economics specifically. So I'm just going to say that, so I met Della about 5 or 6 years ago. She was coming to present at a permaculture design certificate course up in Bolinas, and I was told, oh yeah, today is going to be alternative economics. Yeah, yay. And I thought, oh my gosh, really? Economics, boring. Okay, well, she seems nice. She looks cool. I mean, maybe she could blow my mind. I don't know. So I thought I knew everything about alternative economics that I wanted to know. I didn't think there was anything else I needed to know about economics or regenerative economies. And as she started speaking, she did indeed blow my mind. So I'm hoping that that happens for those of you who are joining us here today. And so Della, let's just say this, I don't think very many people grow up with the idea of like, oh, I'm going to grow up and be a regenerative economist. So before we get started, maybe you could just tell a little bit about your path and how you got here and with this love and passion for economics.
Absolutely happy to, and so good to be with you, Anne, and thank you, Bay Area Green Tours, for inviting me. So I'm from San Francisco, and I went to UC Davis for college and had a pretty traditional economics classroom experience. I actually did my thesis on whether or not a Walmart entering a developing country would lead to a higher rate of the Human Development Index. So that's quite interesting what I was studying back then. And those classes were interesting, but I had the experience of directing the Vagina Monologues. I don't know if folks know that performance by Eve Ensler. It's many female-identified folks sharing their experiences. And I had folks write their own monologues, and that was a way more impactful experience than the classes that I was taking. And it led me to want to work in the field of sexual violence prevention and intervention. So after college, went to San Jose, lived in San Jose, California for a while. And while I was there at the Rape Crisis Center that I worked at, I heard this metaphor, and it's the upstream metaphor, and it's really guided me and my journey and my work. The metaphor is that you imagine that you're standing at the bank of a river and you see someone float by who's drowning. So you jump in to save them and pull them to shore. But pretty soon you look up and you see others floating down the river drowning. So you jump in and help them out of the river. But pretty soon someone or a group of folks needs to go upstream to figure out, why is everyone falling in the first place? So I heard this metaphor in relation to why it was not only important to support survivors of sexual violence on the hotline and in their crisis calls and their sessions in the police stations, but also to go upstream to figure out, why is it that violence happens? And so I heard this metaphor and I was really touched by the work I was doing, but I was even more touched by the economic difficulty that I was seeing around me. I was really seeing that our nonprofit was not very well funded, and it felt like we were increasingly competing for funding to do work that I just felt was so important and had such value. And I was also seeing rising inequality and homelessness and precariousness, people in jobs that they didn't particularly have meaning in. So I was just sensing all of this around me. And I felt this strong desire to go upstream to figure out, what is it about our economic system that is not providing us with happiness and thriving, planetary health and well-being, et cetera. So I've been on that journey ever since. That led me to Schumacher College, a very special school in England, named after E.F. Schumacher, author of Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. And since then, I've been on this path as a regenerative economist. Sometimes they say renegade economist, but I've just been doing a lot of inviting folks, including myself, to rethink economics, reclaim economics, and transform our economic systems so they're more in line with health and well-being for people on the planet.
Wonderful. Yeah, I know exactly. Again, when I met you that first time in Bolinas, ever since then, I had such a better ability to visualize alternatives, like alternatives to economics instead of alternative economics, and fantasize and create visions that are more equitable and regenerative for everyone. So can you talk a little bit about, I think the other thing that you impart when you speak is that, really, you don't have to go to Schumacher College to be a regenerative economist, right? That we all have it in us to rethink, reframe, and re-envision our own personal, community, social, and larger economies. Can you speak to that about a bit?
Absolutely. So this really connects with my understanding of the root of economics. The root of economics from Greek, oikos, and nomos is from Greek, and it means household management or home management. And if we think about it that way, it started as kind of the domestic home and then kind of expanded to the nation state, the country home. And folks like renegade economist Kate Rayworth say, now we have to think about our planetary home. So who is responsible for planetary home managing, for managing our ecosystems, for supporting the thriving of people on the planet? It's really all of us in everything that we do. It's how we live and the systems that we're a part of and the efforts that we are involved in to change the systems. So really, I see that there's not just this special group of folks who are economists and we ought to look to them to make our decisions, but instead, I really think we need to democratize economics and economic thinking and really see all of us as participating in co-creating the more beautiful and just and equitable economy we wish to see.
Beautiful. So what is a regenerative economist then? So what are some of the key aspects that you live in your life that you'd like to invite other people to really think about and perhaps integrate into their own lives as depending on their situations and their lives?
Yeah, so I consider myself a renegade economist, and I created this little diagram here to showcase just some of the work that I do to give folks a sense of what it might look like to be a regenerative economist. Again, there are many different paths and many different ways that folks can contribute, but I want to share these in case they're inspiring to you all. So this is kind of the garden that I work with in my regenerative economics. So rethinking economics, that that one up there in the right corner, me with the microphone. So I really do a lot of rethinking economics. I host the Upstream podcast, named after the metaphor. And I'm actually coming out with a new documentary today on the debunking the myth of Homo economicus. So really thinking about who we are as humans, who economics says we are as humans, and who we want to be as humans. So rethinking economics in that way, but in also teaching, such as the financial permaculture course that Anne spoke about. So yeah, rethinking economics, that's an element of my work, and just challenging traditional economic thinking and practice. Then on the to the right there, equitable and ecological systems change. So I try to operate on personal level, local level, and then larger systems change initiatives. So in this regard, and I'll speak about it a little bit later, but there's a donut there. I'm engaged in some really exciting systems change initiatives. One of them is donut economics, which I'll talk about later. Another is gross national happiness, which I'll also talk about later. And another one is ecosystem restoration work, which a lot of folks on this call might really be interested in. There's a wonderful movement globally for ecosystem restoration work. So I'm doing that type of work. Then following local and independent economies, supporting local and independent economies. My partner is actually a small local and independent business owner, so I get to live vicariously through his efforts. But I'm working on a local and independent food guide to the neighborhood I grew up in. And I'm also working on a community owned and operated solar power energy cooperative. So that's what that diagram is for. We are trying to democratize and collaboratively own and organize our power in our neighborhood. Then in the bottom left, some of you might know who that gentleman is. That's Fritjof Capra. Fritjof Capra, famous for the Tao of Physics, but also more recently a book called The Systems View of Life. So I support him in his efforts to uphold and uplift the systems view of life. It's really just a way of seeing with new and ancient eyes our economic systems and thinking through our systems change in a more holistic way, and also accepting complexity when it comes to economic systems change. So working with him is really, really wonderful work. Then the bottom center, I have a photo from my work with Mama Sana Vibrant Woman, an amazing group of women in Austin, Texas. These are, they're a group of Black and brown women who have a birthing collective, and they want their organizational structure to mirror their values. So instead of being a traditional top-down hierarchical, non-transparent nonprofit, maybe some folks on this call have that experience, I work with them on how to transform to a worker self-directed nonprofit. So bringing the horizontal governance and equity and horizontal decision-making into a nonprofit structure. So I'm working with them on that project as a consultant. And then finally, in the bottom right, I'm a right livelihood coach. And what this this comes from my interest in Buddhist economics. So how do we take the principles and practices and philosophy of Buddhism, and how do we bring them into our economic practices? So this is something I'm really interested in, and the right livelihood coaching allows me to customize that for individuals. And if you listening are like, what does that mean? What does that have to do with anything? My invitation for you, which I love, there's this beautiful quote by a man named Frederick Buechner, and he says, God calls us to the place where the world's deepest hunger meets our deepest gladness. So if nothing else from that right livelihood triangle there, I invite you to just explore what your relationship is with your work, what your relationship is with work and regenerative economics, and how might you find more places where your deepest hunger, where your deepest gladness meets the world's deepest hunger. So yeah, just a little snapshot of the work that I'm doing as a renegade economist.
Beautiful, Della. I love that. And so, so as we're looking through here, I'm seeing there are so many ways that all of us so many of us on the call today in our own communities, we don't have to do all of these, but we can do some of them, and we can actually come up with our own ways of being regenerative economists, right? And I love that quote. Can you read that quote one more time?
Absolutely. So I'm going to make sure to get it right. So the quote is Frederick Buechner, and the quote is, "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." So the invitation again is, what is your deep gladness, and where does that meet the world's deep hunger? And could that help to point to your right livelihood path?
Beautiful. So just thinking about that quote and economics and us as individuals and what we're able to do, I've heard you speak a lot about, so part of being a regenerative economist is actually changing the goals, our economic goals, right? And this is not just our own individual ones, but really having an influence on our greater communities, our greater nation, actually, to really shift the goals of our economy. I just wanted to give one of my favorite examples is from Soil Not Oil by Vandana Shiva. And she talks about how if the World Bank's goal is to support fossil fuel infrastructure around the world. And so if we're doing that, and then we're looking for what countries need support. So she used India as an example. And so the World Bank did a study and said, oh, well, all the roads that are being used, 80% of the public transportation of these roads is coming from automobiles, right? But they completely ignored the local communities and the local infrastructure that didn't have paved roads. And when they went to look at that and actually looked at what local smaller communities outside of large cities were actually using, they found that it was actually ox carts and ox carts and cycle rickshaws that made up 80% of the nation's transportation, right? So again, this shift in, if you're only looking for how fossil fuel that infrastructure can be built, and you're ignoring what's underneath, that goal leaves a lot of people out. So can you speak more to that, Della, and maybe even some of the movements that you see coming forth right now that are helping us all change our goals?
Absolutely. Yeah. So changing the goal of our economic system, this is a huge element of being a regenerative economist. And I think it operates on multiple levels. So I invite you all as individuals to think about, how are you measuring success in your own life? How are you measuring success in your work and in your lives, in your communities? And how might you change that to be more in line with regenerative, sustainable, economic, equitable systems change? So that's on the individual level. And then when we look at the collective level, there are some really exciting initiatives, some solutions to move us into alternative goals that are more in alignment with well-being for people on the planet. And I'll give an example of why this is important. I remember I was knitting one day and my brother turned to me and said, Della, why are you knitting? Don't you know that's bad for the economy? And in some ways, he was right that me making my own clothes in that moment was not as good for the economy as if I were to drive in a car to a Walmart and buy a shirt that was made in Vietnam. That technically would be better for the economy. And why is that? It's because we're measuring a numeric value for our economic systems. Gross domestic product is the total exchange of goods and services, and it is the indicator of well-being for our economic health and well-being. So I have two initiatives that I want to share, two solutions that are really exciting. The first one is, the first one is called the donut economics, and it's spelled in the British way, if you're curious about that, because it was the root teacher is Kate Raworth, renegade economist, who I mentioned earlier. So this is the donut. This is the donut in front of you. And what this is an alternative goal for the economy. And this can be both local, like a city or a community, but it also can be national and it can be global. So it would just be customizable. So here in the center part, you have water, food, health, education, income and work, etc. That is what's called the social foundation. So we imagine, let's take Santa Cruz, where I know some folks are calling in from today. Let's take the donut in the center. We would look to how many folks in the city of Santa Cruz have adequate drinking water, have healthy, adequate food, have quality healthcare. And we would measure that and we'd kind of fill it out. If it wasn't doing very well, we'd make it low. And if it was very full, we'd make it all the way full. And then we have on this outer ring, we have the 9 planetary boundaries from a group of researchers. Rockstrom is the lead researcher. And these are looking at our planet's needs and health and well-being. So there are specific measurements that we can look towards and specific tipping points that would tip us out of health for our planet. And unfortunately, as you may already know, we have overshot in several of these categories. But the idea of the donut is it would change the goal of the economy into that green space, the space that Kate Raworth in the center there calls the safe and just space for humanity. So it reframes the goal of economics to not just be endless growth or growth at any cost, to what brings us in the donut. So what is it that will meet our social foundations while staying within the planetary boundaries? So the goal of the economy is meeting humans' needs within consideration of the planetary needs. So this is this goal. And I will say that the folks doing the donut economics work have just come out with the Donut Economics Action Lab, and community groups can join freely and prototype this for their own communities. So Amsterdam, the first city to adopt the donut for their city measurement tool. And then I'm one of the co-founders and one of the facilitators for the California Donut Economics Coalition. So we're measuring the donut for California, and we're hoping that that will help policymakers and different nonprofits with their work that they're doing to get us within this space for the state of California. So wherever you are, feel free to take this. It's open source, and to adopt it to your communities and start something locally. So that is very exciting to share. And the second one to share is the movement of gross national happiness. And this comes from the Kingdom of Bhutan. So this connects with that background that I shared about Buddhist economics. So what this is also changing the goal of the economy, but it's a little bit different. So the way that they've done this is that it actually started from the Bhutanese king, Jigme Wangchuck, who he was very young when he became king. This was in the 1970s. His father died and he became king at a young age. So what he did was he went on a pilgrimage. He walked around the country and he asked people, okay, I'm your leader. What is it that you want from me? How can I serve you? And he thought people might say infrastructure, jobs, roads, etc., but they actually said, we want to be happy. And so there was this famous moment when a journalist asked him, well, what is the gross domestic product of Bhutan anyway? And he said, we don't really care about that. We don't even measure that. We measure gross national happiness. And so that set off a chain of events to actually measure gross national happiness. So what they do is they do a survey every 4 years where they ask folks about their happiness in these areas. So right here, you see the 9 domains of gross national happiness. So there's sets of questions. So they're to the individual. And they include really beautiful questions like, do you know the native plants around you? How often do you wear the customary dress? Do you celebrate the holidays of the culture? They also ask, do you believe that trees are the home of spirits and deities? Do you believe trees are sacred, essentially? They ask you, how many people are so close to you that they would help you if you were sick? How many people would help you if you were in financial trouble? And also, how many people would come if you had a life celebration? So as you can see, it's not just, are you happy, yes or no? These are very deep questions considering the happiness. And then they're able to take those and then make sense of it and say, where do we need to grow, but in our happiness? So maybe, women in rural areas are struggling with good governance in that area and they need to strengthen that. Or maybe teenage boys are having problems with their health in cities. And so they're able to cater to where they want to grow. And one point is, this is also based on contentment. So it's not about maximum levels of happiness. There's sufficiency levels. So there's this deep piece around contentment that's built into this. So yeah, this is a development philosophy. So it's changing the goal of the economy. It's also a policy screening tool. So they look at policies and they look at them under these 9 domains, like how will that road affect health? How will that road affect living standards, et cetera? It's also a measurement tool, as I mentioned, and it's an inner transition tool. So it is combined with mindfulness and loving compassion, kindness practices as well in schools and businesses and in the government. So this as well has been taken and contextualized to other places worldwide. There's a group in Switzerland who are trying to get it in their national referendum. There's also a group in Sweden. And there's also different businesses. If you all know the clothing manufacturer Eileen Fisher, she has learned about gross national happiness and is trying to bring it into her business model. So there's some really creative ways to do this too. I will say there are some challenges with Bhutan's history, some issues with ethnic cleansing and religious persecution. So I do not want to diminish that. I do not want to say they are 100% happy. But what I will say is, as a vehicle for changing the goal of the economy, the work that has been done around thinking this is quite beautiful. And I think there's a lot of aspects that can be contextualized elsewhere.
Beautiful. Yeah. And actually, I was reading up on the gross national happiness just in preparation for our talk today. And so I read that in 2011, the UN General Assembly actually passed a resolution based on the work in Bhutan. So it's the 10-year anniversary of the UN. Their resolution was called Happiness Towards a Holistic Approach to Development, with an invitation to nations around the world to take a look at gross national happiness and how they can actually implement these thoughts and ideas and these measurements into their own countries, which I think was so beautiful. So 10 years down the line, it's great to hear that there are actually other countries that are picking it up, and companies. And I love that you brought up Eileen Fisher. I mean, what's your thought, Della? Do you think actually corporations or larger businesses like Eileen Fisher are a better place to start than trying to start in a large government? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I think when we get into businesses, when I spoke to numerics, money, profit, GDP being the goal, and I said that is on the individual level and also on this societal level through GDP. It's unfortunately also on the business level, right? Which is, profit for a business growing is being very important, right, to that business's health and success. So it is true that gross national happiness can be utilized, like they in Eileen Fisher, or there's a few other companies around the world there's one called BTS. It's a Vietnamese shoe company, and they're actually measuring this for all their employees and also their customers. And they're saying, how can we increase that? It is still a for-profit business. So perhaps there's other systemic changes that can be combined, but certainly within changing a business, it helps with the employees' satisfaction and all of that. And also it can help with their contribution to their communities. So yeah, I think it's definitely really interesting. Although personally, I'm a little bit more in favor of how do we move to not-for-profit / business combinations where profit is utilized for social and mission-driven projects or good, and 100% of profit is redirected to those positive efforts. That's my personal thing I'm interested in. If folks want to know more about that, there's a really good book called How on Earth? A Not-for-Profit World by 2050, rethinking like what if we had a world without for-profit. So that type of thing inspires me. But certainly, as changing the goal, gross national happiness at any level can be useful. And I'll just point out too, as individuals, we can also think through gross national happiness. You can look at this maybe at this new year point and say, how am I doing on all these 9 domains? How am I doing with the questions? The questions are freely available. You can take them, and then you can help that guide your own levels of happiness in your life and in your communities.
Yeah, I love that invitation, Della. I particularly like the time use piece on the gross national happiness, because I find for myself that it's actually how I use my time and what I spend my time on, being really intentional about that and giving that a lot of effort, or practicing good use of time, actually definitely contributes to my sense of overall well-being, happiness, and contentment. So excellent. Wow, so these are beautiful movements. And so you've talked about, on a global scale and a little bit more on the local scale. And so if we're looking at these initiatives that you're really interested in, let's bring it down to the individual level, which you've started to do. How can folks that are listening either today or when they're listening to this later really make sense of this regenerative economics and these different movements? And what are some of the concrete ways that they can quickly actually bring this idea of regenerative economics into their lives, and happiness and contentment and well-being for the planet and themselves?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is a really good question. And when folks may hear this, perhaps those listening, the immediate thing comes to our consumption, right? How can we consume more ethically, like get off of Amazon and try to shop more locally, for example, or support, local retailers, that kind of thing, or have our energy more localized, et cetera. So all of that, very important. And yet I sometimes worry if we're all doing that and not making it more inclusive or broadening the participation ability, then we're not really creating that system change that we hope for. So I really invite folks to think, on your personal level, like your behaviors, your actions, your ability to consume, et cetera, but also to contribute to those larger systems change initiatives. So that more folks can participate in regenerative economics. So finding causes or different engagements that you think would be helpful. Getting involved locally is always a really fun thing, particularly now with so many small local independent businesses going under with COVID, really reaching out and seeing how can we build solidarity and social cohesion there. But is there an initiative that you're excited by? The public banking movement is another one that I've gotten involved with, and that's a really fun one as well. But there are so many great larger scale initiatives, grassroots movements that people can get involved with. But to kind of summarize what I was talking about in terms of you all thinking, I just have some questions for you. So, really think to what is success in your life? How are you measuring it? Dr. Haven To, the former program director of the Gross National Happiness Center, said, you are attentive to what you measure. You are attentive to what you measure. So what is it that you're measuring? How are you defining success in your life? What is your goal? And then what stood out of the activities that I described? Is there anything within your current workspace, if it is a business, that you could change? Or do you want to start an initiative or join a project? Is that something of interest to you? And then also, where are you at on your right livelihood path? Is it helpful to see that work can potentially be part of your spiritual path, that it can be your engagement, your contribution, your service? Do you want to do some exploration of where the world's deep hunger meets your deep gladness? How are you feeling about that? So how does that invitation of thinking through our livelihood change how you're feeling? And some folks choose to stay in their work and change something from within. Others choose to create something. Others kind of create a balance or a garden of livelihood paths, as I have done. So just invite folks to explore that. And then finally, I just invite folks to go on this journey upstream. It just, whenever you're facing a social or societal challenge or problem, whether it's political, economic, ecological, et cetera, what happens when you go upstream? What are those root causes? And how can you both help people out of the river, but also go upstream to think through those more philosophical, deeper theoretical pieces as well? So those are my invitations for folks listening.
Wonderful. Wow, Della. I love that, your garden of your livelihood path. That's such a beautiful way of putting it, right? And how can we all create our own garden paths of livelihood and thrivelihood? Wonderful. So we're going to move shortly into questions. But just on this note of economics, I found this wonderful quote actually from an article that you were featured in, Della, by Yanis Varoufakis. Can you say his last name better than me?
Oh, yes. Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister of Greece. Yeah.
Greece. And he said, and I just want to just put this in the context of the United States, of us here now, and I think there are actually people from all around the world right now, but he said, empowering citizens to speak authoritatively about the economy is a prerequisite for democracy and a precondition for the good society. And just thinking about goals, like this is just not a goal that we have to make ourselves, the citizens of the United States, really literate and really able to articulate economic ideas, right? So this idea of coming in where you're leading us right now is really lovely, because we can enter on an individual level and in a community level and larger level, depending on where we're at. So I love that. I would love if more people could take on an interest in economics and the way that you are presenting it and the way so many people that you're working with are presenting it. So anything else you'd like to add, Della, before we go into questions?
Yeah, just in alignment with that, just as I shared that I studied traditional economics and then really got to do an alternative economics degree. And then today, as we're releasing this episode on debunking the myth of Homo economicus, I just want to share there are many movements to rethink economics. There's actually Rethinking Economics is a student-led global group and that are really going in and challenging economic thinking. So it's just been a lot on my mind, is to first of all, how do economists partner with, other disciplines, sociology, anthropology, feminist studies, et cetera? Very, very important. And also, how do we just go in and challenge economics? I don't know if folks know this, but Adam Smith, who was one of the, fathers of economic thinking, he was considered a moral philosopher, and economics was in the Department of Moral Philosophy. So I love to think about how do we return economics to the realm of a moral philosophy? How do we ask deeper questions around what is work, and how do we meet needs, and can we trust each other, and who are we as humans? These deeper philosophical questions into our economic thinking. I get really excited by that.
Yeah, you even made a bumper sticker that I have on my water bottle. I think it says, "Let's make economics moral again." I get so many questions about that sticker when I carry it. What is that? What? Was it ever moral? What? So it's really creative. It makes people think differently, right? So, well, maybe, so all of you, if you have questions, we're going to be taking questions in the chat. But Della, I would love to invite you. Della, in addition to so many of the things that she's involved with, she's a beautiful poet and writer. And we thought it would be really lovely to end on one of my favorite poems that she has written. You want to introduce that and speak it?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So this is a poem called "What is Economics?" And hopefully it kind of summarizes some of what I was speaking about.
And I would also just say, everyone, this is a good time to just close your eyes or sit back. You don't have to be listening or watching the screen. You can just hear Della's reflections on who is the economist or what.
Thank you. Especially if you're having a little Zoom fatigue, you can have a eye close moment.
Yeah.
So what is economics? Economics is about our relationship with ourselves. It's about how we use our time, what we do for leisure, our pace, about our ratio of being to doing, about our connection with our hobbies, our passions, about that which we can call our own, about our locus of control, about our sense of self-worth, about the rhythm of our days, our relationship with the seasons, about how we introduce ourselves, about the conditions of our past, the quality of our present, the potential of our future, about our freedoms and our constraints, about how we meet our needs, about our role in society, our right livelihood, our mythopoetic identity. Economics is about our relationship with one another. It's about whether we see collaborators or competitors, separation or solidarity, interbeing or alienation. It's about our level of trust, about the strength of our democracy, about how we relate to power, about how we manage our housework, our child rearing, our commons, about how we care and how we get cared for, about what we give and what we get and how much we share. Economics is about our relationship with the earth. It's about our connection with land, our bioregions, our watersheds, about our sense of belonging, about what we build and how we build it, about what and how we eat, where our food comes from, and what happens to our waste, about whether we see the natural world as a supply house or a sewer, a battlefield or a lover, an animate being, Gaia, or our larger ecological self. Economics has the ability to isolate, subjugate, unite, and empower. It's myth and fact, crisis and opportunity, alive and lifeless, systemic and personal. Economics is not simply the bottom line, the marketplace, or the profit margin. And it's not something outside of us. Economics is valueful, valuable, and here.
Beautiful, Della. Yeah. So much gratitude for you for this and your perspective today. So we are going to open up for questions in our last little more than 15 minutes. It's a lot of information. So if anyone wants to clarify, let's see what we've got here. People have been inspired by the Upstream podcast. Lots of beautiful, love this. Garden of Right Livelihood Paths, also agreement that is so amazing. And yeah, someone said our locus of control, yes. So let's see. Della, thanks for your insight and ideas. I have a small native plant landscaping business and I'm starting to grow, wanting to be very thoughtful about how I do. Your words encourage me. Yes, so that's great. Let's see. I'm not seeing a, let's see, I was excited. This is from Sari. Sorry. I was so excited when you described advocating for the movements towards nonprofits that use the horizontal cooperative model. I think people are going to walk away from your talk inspired to move that way, among other things. I'm sure there are other resources out there for the mechanics, but can you speak to the broader messaging that can be used to bring in others to this plan, idea, model? For example, how do you approach your coworkers given the profit-driven economic system we are currently embedded in? Economics isn't framed as an easy discussion topic in our society. Absolutely, Sari. Della.
Yeah, happy to. And I think this also goes for Peggy, your comment about growing your business. So one memory that I have is Rob Hopkins, the founder of the Transition Town movement. I was sitting with him once and he said, you know, I have a son and I do want my son to grow to a certain height. And then I want him to stop growing. And then I want him to grow in other ways, like the quality of his character and his interests and hobbies. And so, I do think that, for Peggy and for others, that there may be growth that is involved in our enterprises and our businesses. I want for us to meet our needs. And sometimes I work with folks on, what are all of your needs? And did you include education in that and professional development? And also, did you consider meeting your needs in ways that are the most ethical, the most sustainable, the most just? So, if everyone were to that point, great. But the thing is, so many aren't. So I do think, some growth to that point is good. And so, there is this quote by Kate Rue where she says, we need to be growth agnostic, put that other goal forward, and then some growth may happen and some degrowth may happen. So I really love that way of thinking. But in terms of inviting our coworkers or those in our lives to think about alternative models, in terms of the horizontal governance piece, I really do think that, Richard Wolff, he says it well. He's like, we say that we live in a democracy, and yet when we go into our businesses, our business structures, we leave democracy at the door. We're in inherently non-democratic spaces. So few in both traditional nonprofits, like hierarchical nonprofits, but also typical businesses, they're non-democratic. The workers don't have much say in things. They're usually told what to do. Things aren't, there's not a lot of creativity and collaboration that's possible. So for a business, the worker cooperative is a beautiful model to democratize the workplace, to have conversations about things, horizontal governance, equity issues, all of that. And then this worker self-directed nonprofit is, again, what I said about taking some of the gifts of the worker cooperative model, but for a nonprofit space. So, one time, or some folks may say, oh, well, that seems very clumsy for all of us to make all decisions about everything, but that is not the case. You do not have to do that. So for the women in Texas that I'm working with, we're inspired by the Sustainable Economies Law Center, an amazing local organization in the East Bay here. And they are a worker self-directed nonprofit, and they have circles. So they have circles that are fully autonomous. You can think of them as committees or groups within the organization, and they are autonomous and fully functioning. But then they can have a shared circle for everyone, that kind of all membership group. But that helps with the autonomy. And then what I love about this too is that the coordinator of one circle is the member of another circle. So you may be the coordinator of one circle, like I'm the coordinator of the childcare circle for Mama Sana Vibrant Woman. But in another circle, like the development circle, I'm a member. So it really does this interesting thing with power and responsibility and accountability. And it really gives a sense of equality and solidarity that's really beautiful. So if I were you, I'd speak to the benefits, to what would it feel like for us to have more contribution and co-ownership in our spaces, more voice, more potential for buy-in, and more equity in our organizations. So yeah, bringing democracy to the workplace is certainly a beautiful invitation.
Wonderful. So there's a question here, many positive comments. Sandra has a question. Have you any connections or resources for how arts and economics interact?
Arts and economics?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one story that I think could be inspiring to folks is there's a woman named Sarah Corbett. Sarah Corbett. She's in the UK, and she calls herself a craftivist. And she says that if we want our world or our economics or our world to be beautiful, just, and kind, we need our activism to be beautiful, just, and kind. So she uses craft for activism. So she has all these things that she does. And one of my favorite ones is that she makes these little scrolls with a little bow and embossment. So they're very beautiful, handwritten. And she does something called shop dropping. So instead of shoplifting, shop dropping. And so what she does is she writes on them, she says, if clothes could talk, what story would your clothes tell? Would they tell stories of exploitation and harm to the environment and greed? Or would they tell stories of love and care? And then she rolls them up, puts a little bow, and then has people go into clothing stores where the materials are not sustainable or they're sweatshop labor. And she has them drop them into the pockets so that when people are trying them on, they open it and they think differently. And what I like about that is it's creative, it's artistic, it's inviting people to think differently, but it's not shaming. It's really just inviting people into a systems level perspective. And then of course she does larger systems change initiatives too. But so yeah, Sarah Corbett and she has a couple books on craftivism, but I think that's one place where economics and art really connect. But I mean, I would say for me, I think I really do try to balance my more theoretical economic work with some more artistic work. So doing the podcast is actually really helpful because I get to do like some sonic, some soundscape work and music and things like that. Also the poetry, like what are the other ways that I could talk about economics that feel helpful? So I think, yeah, I invite you to really explore economics and art and see where that takes you. But there's a lot of potential.
Wonderful. Oh, I love that. Craftivism. I've not heard that before. Okay, so now we have a question from Monica. Have you any connections or resources? Oh wait, this is the same one, sorry. Let's see. Looking for questions, lots of lovely, looks like Shen Wu has a question. I'm also feeling super inspired. I'm curious about the interaction between for-profit and nonprofits that you talked about. That's an area I'm also very interested in. I wrote down the How on Earth book you recommended. Is there additional information you could share now though, in addition to?
Yeah, absolutely. So, let me take the Mama Sana Vibrant Woman group for an example. So they are a nonprofit, right? And I'm working with them on the horizontal governance piece, but also on this not-for-profit business model thing where I'm saying, nonprofits typically, if they're typically funded, often are reliant on grants and donations. This at least was my experience at the Rape Crisis Center. Understandably, there's no thing to make money on with rape crisis centers. So, and for this, they're providing birthing support for Black and Brown women in Austin, Texas. But if anyone's familiar with Anand Giridis's book, Winners Take All, it's a really excellent book on how foundations, especially if they're funded by very wealthy folks, can often not fund projects that would actually change systems because there's no benefit to them. They benefit from the status quo. So there is a certain, maybe folks on this call have felt it, when nonprofits or social and environmental good organizations are reliant on donations and grant funding, it can feel very trapping and very limiting. And so the idea behind this not-for-profit / business model is what are some naturally profit generating activities that a nonprofit could bring in to build their financial resilience and give them some unallocated funds. So for the women in Texas, we're working on a childcare cooperative. So a childcare cooperative, it helps support so many families right now are struggling with childcare. I think the average parent gets like uninterrupted 2 minutes and 30 seconds of uninterrupted time right now, something like that, something horrific. So the idea is we're saying, how do we create this childcare cooperative that creates profit motive, but then all that profit is funded back to the nonprofit. One example of this is the YMCA. So they have their for-profit gym, so gym membership, and then they sell gym memberships, but the profit then goes to support activities for low-income youth. And then another one of my favorites is in San Francisco, we have a bar called The Interval. Super swanky bar, like those classic, like big chunky ice cubes, ridiculously good whiskey, that kind of place. But 100% of the profit goes literally upstairs to the to the Environmental Conservation Foundation, the Long Now Foundation. So that's another way. It's like they're just tapping into a for-profit model that then 100% of the profits go. So I would say you would want to make sure that in the business that it's ethical and sustainable and folks are well paid. Maybe that business could be a worker cooperative. But then, yeah, at a certain point, as I said, or maybe I didn't say this, happiness and income are only correlated up to a certain amount. I've heard different numbers, but I've heard like 100,000. I don't think that's right for the Bay Area. But, after that, more money doesn't equal more happiness. So, in a business where there's so much profit happening, how can that profit be harnessed for social or environmental good? And yeah, again, How on Earth, a great book that's coming out about this topic.
I can't wait. Wonderful. So there's a request for you to speak about the eco-restoration work that you're interested in, but just as a follow-up to that last question, Sandra asked, are there tax problems when nonprofits do this, what you were just talking about? So then we'll come back to the eco-restoration camps.
Yeah, I would say, I don't know about tax problems, I'd just say tax considerations. But yeah, certainly I would encourage folks to look into their own business model to see how much of their income that they could get from this. But I also have seen some pretty creative things. Like I've seen there's a brewery in the Northwest where they literally they're a regular brewery, and then they just donate 100% of their profits after people are paid, rent's paid, supply chains are paid to a nonprofit that's in their neighborhood. So I wouldn't see there's any tax problems there. In fact, it'd probably be a tax write-off for them to donate that profit. So I think there are creative ways to do that, but I would encourage folks to look into the details. As for the ecosystem restoration work, so John Liu, if folks know about him, amazing international person who's doing some great work in creating ecosystem restoration camps around the world. And there's many that have popped up, but there is one in California. So I would just encourage folks to look up ecosystem restoration camps. But the tagline is, let's go camping. And the idea is like getting folks together and helping ecosystems come back to life is really inspiring. So I was a part of some early conversations with the California group, and now they've gone full into a lot of amazing initiatives and projects. So I would just encourage folks to look into that. But it is a global movement now and very exciting. And there was an article recently about could Green New Deals include ecosystem restoration camp corps? So could this be a part of a national agenda moving forward? For jobs and for ecosystem restoration? I think that's a phenomenal idea. So there's some great work on that. And there's also an initiative for a California Green New Deal. So there's so much exciting things happening in the Solutionaries vein.
Yes, beautiful. So there's just wonderful comments in the chat, Della. I'm not going to read all of them. I hope that's okay. Lydia did post the link to your podcast, Upstream Podcast, which I highly recommend people tuning into. It's just incredibly inspiring. And a lot of talk about John Liu and some information from Shenzhen Wu related to ecosystem restoration. This course is starting up soon. And she signed up, and it's Ecosystem Restoration Design online course. Wow, that sounds wonderful. So we will be sharing these resources with all of you in a follow-up email. So look for that. And looks like Marissa spent 3 days with Della at Piscinus Ranch with John Liu 2 years ago. So that's a lovely connection that we all have. Let's see, any last questions? So there's a lot of, John Paul says, yes, it is. Della, you are amazing. Such a gift of bright light for the world. Thank you. I think I agree. I'll say yes to that. Let's see. And then Julie wrote, for Bagot, we are selling team building and video filming services to fund our programming, such as Solutionaries Speak,
Nice.
and an upcoming virtual tours to school. So yes, Julie, excellent way that we're, leveraging, I think is what that has been called, but finding a new word for that would definitely be, it's regenerative, right? It's actually using, or it's accessing, and gosh, what would be a great word for that? But just different than leveraging, which I think has come to sound so corporate.
Harnessing.
Harnessing, harnessing the pulse, right? So, and again, finding out, I guess, so us as an organization of Bagot, where is our greatest joy, right? Where is our greatest joy and our greatest abilities able to meet the hunger for the world? And I might have gotten that switched around, but how can we as an organization think that way, right? And on an individual, but as an organization, where does that overlap, and what's our contribution? There we go. Marissa says reinventing, pivoting. Yes. So thank you, John Paul, as well. He says I'm amazing too. And Lydia is amazing, everyone. Okay. So are there any last questions? We're just right on time. I love this.
I do have two things to say at the end there.
Yes.
Is this a good time? Unless there's any more questions.
This is a great time. Yes.
Great. I do want to say for the, because it sounds like folks are really inspired by the not-for-profit, cooperative, collaborative model. One thing I do think about is the role of the government, right? Like, this is an open question for me. Maybe this is a leading inquiry that I have with my work is, yes, beautiful if we are finding ways to generate income and profit to fund our mission-driven work. Awesome. And yet, what do we want to have supported by the commons and by our government, right? So people have asked me that, and I don't really know, what should be public, what should be with the government, and then what should be left to nonprofits. It's an interesting question. But I do think one answer to that is the multi-stakeholder approach, or multi-stakeholder cooperative, where we include members of government with nonprofits, or community members and participants or consumers in on that, and vice versa, so that the government operations also include members of nonprofits, et cetera. So that's one thing, but I definitely see that as a leading inquiry. And then the last thing I'll say, I really appreciate all the sense of amazingness and all of this. And yet I really, really want to honor and celebrate all the teachers and folks who have really led this work. This regenerative economics is not new. And there's been so much excellent work on this. Herman Daly, for example, is someone who comes up, and Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, right? That kind of work. But, and then cooperative and gift economies. This is really ancient. There's a lot of indigenous wisdom traditions, the potlatch ceremony, for example. So there's a lot there that I'm simply kind of uplifting or supporting or wanting to help proliferate. But I really, just to close, what I've found on my right livelihood path to be the most helpful is that when I graduated from Schumacher College, Satish Kumar, the founder of Schumacher College, said, do not get a job, cultivate a right livelihood. And it takes radical trust, but I feel like since that moment, I've just stepped into what I consider kind of like the Taoist perception of flow, where I've just stepped into something and just said yes to the universe and yes to what is. And just so many beautiful opportunities come up and are engaged. So I encourage folks to just follow their interest and see what's engaging, particularly right now. I just find so many folks are feeling so depressed or down or trapped in this time of quarantine. So I just want to impart some inspiration and solutionary visioning that this is a beautiful time for some creative dreaming and co-collaborating, even if it's via Zoom. So wishing you all the best wherever you are on your path.
Beautiful, Della. Thank you. Yeah, really now is the time to collaborate and co-create more now than ever before, given the unique time in history that we're living. So just some beautiful strategies and tools and thought-provoking ideas today. Thank you so much, Della. We would like to ask you to stay tuned for an invite. You'll all get one for our next Solutionaries Speak, happening on Thursday, March 11th at the same time from 12 to 1. We would love to see you all again there. Someplace if you'd like to make a donation to Solutionaries Speak to promote this programming moving forward. Again, we'll thank our sponsors for today's event, which is Beneficial State Bank. Thank you so much.